Walrus live near the ocean, where the water's freezing but the land is easing on the continent of North America. Walrus live near the ocean, where the water's freezing but the land is easing on the continent of North America. Let's listen to the music of the world.
How about that?
To the music of the world. Bye-bye.
This is actually one of my art pieces. You know, this is a tie string surgical mask that, you know, and anyway, this is my hacker for the day. So this is going to be on the table. We're going to, the folks in the middle here, if you could clear the table. We're going to be using that as the center point. Somehow Ian got me to participate in this, and you know, this is not the P word. You all know what the P word is?
No.
Panel. This is not the P word. I'm calling it a cabinet. And the way we're going to proceed is I've already selected 3 dyads of people, scientists, artists, 3 groups, and we're going to meet at the table here with the hacker. And I will have a prompt question, and it'll be 5 minutes. So there'll be 3 5-minute discussions, and then the 6 people will then sit at the table, and this is going to be called the long table. Lois Weaver from Split Britches, which is a performance art group, devised the idea of the long table, which is, it's like a dinner party, and you're sitting around a table and you're having a conversation. There's an empty chair on the table. The empty chair is available for anyone in the audience who wants to come and join the conversation. If there's no empty chair, someone can go up in the audience and tap someone and replace them at the table. So it's about keeping the conversation going in a very democratic way. So that's a process that we're going to try today. So let's start.
North America. Time to change the bell. North America.
There's your music. Okay, for the
North America.
will you shut up?
It's not Alexa.
North America. Bye-bye.
So for the first cabinet meeting, we have scientist Hillary. Let's hear it for Hillary. And we have artist Jupong. Did I say your name right? Okay, so why don't you two sit over here? And here's a mic for you. And you're still a little closer together. So welcome. Thank you for participating in the cabinet. I'm just going to give you a prompt question, and then hopefully a conversation will ensue. And the question is, if you were given $1 million, what would you do with it? How would it change your life?
Go first. I have to think about it.
Well, you're having just the two of you.
Okay. So I guess the question is this the $1 million to me personally, or is the $1 million, say, to fund my research? That's what usually comes into my head.
Maybe it's you decide you don't want to be a scientist anymore. You want to go on vacation.
No, I don't think that's what would happen. I think I still have to be a scientist for a while. But I would probably try to start a new project. something that I haven't done before. And it would probably start with science, but
That's what I would do. I would start the organization, and I'm not sure if it's a nonprofit or social enterprise, something that involves artists, scientists, and everything in between. It would be dedicated to climate justice, and yeah, that's
so I'm certainly inspired by this workshop to think about what could you do with $1 million to start to do this art-science connection better, right? I'm clearly on the science side, and I don't have a current project that links art and science, but I'm kind of thinking I want one. And I realize that's hubristic. It's like, oh, I want one of those. Where do I go get one? And obviously it doesn't work like that. But I would probably, if I had $1 million and you had $1 million, maybe we could put them together and start something.
Yeah. And I would, so to be more concrete, right now I work for Goddard College. We have 2 sites, and one of the sites is Fort Worden in Port Townsend, Washington. And it's a site that's, it was never an active military site, but was built as a military installation. Now it's a state park, and
Been there.
oh, have you? Okay.
I went to graduate school in Seattle, so.
Oh, okay, yeah. So the interesting challenge that's coming up for us now is we've started a concentration in indigenous and decolonial art, and we're trying to work in partnership, in collaboration with the Olympic Peninsula tribal people. And we're located in a site, a very colonial site. So that's the big challenge facing us, is how do we build trust with the indigenous people who were, horribly oppressed, colonized by the fort.
So that question comes up for me is, do indigenous peoples, and I hate to even put it in those terms because you can't generalize that way, do they want science? Do they want scientists to be involved in something?
Well, I can only speak for the Coast Salish people. I think, and I don't speak for them, but I think what they would say is that they don't want colonial science. They have their own science.
Mm-hmm.
The indigenous people around the world have survived incredible environmental changes for millennia. And so they've done that through, what we call science, observation of changes. They have incredible, the Coast Salish folks that I know have incredible, deep knowledge of the ecology, plant life, animal life, and they've lived in relationship with, with what we call nature, the non-human species. So I think that's for me, working with them and on this concentration has really got me rethinking what we even call art and what we call science, and the fact that we, in the colonial world, divide those.
So on the one side of what I think about is we talk about the coevolution of life in the biosphere, and I'm usually talking about the ancient environment. But I'm wondering if that concept of coevolution might be useful in the modern era in thinking about climate change, or even about, can we learn something from their unseparated kind of connection to the world that tells us about geoengineering or adaptation or climate intervention? It could be cool.
Yeah, I think, as I keep asking who's at the table and really noticing who's missing at the table. So that's what I would say is, who's missing in this conversation is people who come from communities that have lived for generations and generations in relationship to a particular place.
Okay, thank you. Let's hear it for Hillary and DuPont. Thank you. So next we have Van Damme, is that right? And Cynthia. Okay. Welcome. Let's hear it for him. Come on. Thank you for coming. And the question I have for you is, with the Me Too world and Black Lives Matter, what are the systemic obstacles you see for diversity and gender equality, and how do you respond to that?
What are the obstacles?
Could you say the question in the mic?
Yes. The question is, in the Me Too world and the Black Lives Matter, what are the systemic obstacles you see for diversity and gender equality, and how can you respond to that?
Anybody over 65? They should just take a hike. No. I mean, I think when I see the young people and all of the naive but wonderfully unabashed lack of fear to be themselves, and the young women in general coming out with Me Too movement. It's the older people in power that are so that's the obstacle I see. Their inability to open their minds and change. And of course they're not gonna all just die tomorrow, but that's all I got to begin with here in this conversation.
Well, I think it's a great question, and I think that in any culture where there's a dominant race and gender, and that's true here, I think that it's people say white supremacy, and certainly that's an obstacle. It's a major obstacle. But there's also this realm of people who, I work on paradigms a lot. Because they're immersed in one framework and one way of looking at things, they don't see the other perspective. And I call that, for lack of a better term, I call that paradigm blindness. It's not necessarily ill intent, but it's a kind of being unable to see, being unable to walk in others' shoes, and even to know that there's something else to see. The idea of so those in our society who are privileged and therefore have the blindness of privilege or paradigm blindness can constitute a systemic obstacle. In fact, all the systems in place are meant for and built for those folks. And I'm in this interesting position of having less sociological structural privilege in this country, because of the color of my skin, because of my gender. But when I go back to India, I have caste privilege, and not the highest caste, somewhere in the middle, but definitely a lot more privilege, because when if I were to be living and working in India, then my last name immediately would tell employers and other people, where I belong in the social stratification. And I'd never have to think about it, because I would take for granted that I'd be treated with a modicum of, basic respect. So I know what that feels like, to be paradigm blind, to be privilege blind. But I also know, through being here and being a minority here, what it's like to be at the receiving end of that thing. And my university, I work at a really lively working class university that's an incubator for great new, different ways of looking at the world, and I love it there. And one of the things that we did was, I think we had the first.
Where is
this? Is Framingham State University. We did I think possibly the country's first transdisciplinary Black Lives Matter teach-in a couple of years ago. and which was utterly personally transformative for me. So I think that that's part of it, is that the systems in place are just so such behemoths. They are these huge structures that have this enormous inertia. They're barriers to change, and it's both because of actively malignant people, but also a large amount of inertia comes from people who are not malignant, who do not have ill intentions, but simply don't know that there are other ways to see the world and cannot unsee the way they look at the world. And I think maybe that's one place we have to go. And in fact, as Jupon pointed out, the fact that we didn't talk about environmental racism is a big deal, and certainly a big deal to me.
Well, I hope you all know I didn't literally mean everybody over 65 should die, because I'm 70 and I'm gonna hang on for at least until I'm 100. So in any case, I didn't mean that literally, but people, it seems, is it human nature? I don't know, that when they have power, they hold onto it like this, and then therefore they become these narrow, unallowing of other, looking at other options. I don't know if it's human nature or not.
I don't know if I can answer that question, but I think, I've been reading, I'm no expert, but I've been reading a lot about hunter-gatherer tribes, and how people, typically the subsets that live together consistently are, without overgeneralizing, the ones I've read about anyway, are like 50-odd people or so. And they really, really know each other well, and their environs and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of different cultural differences, because not all indigenous people have the same culture. But the ones I've read about, there's more egalitarianism. And in fact, if you look at the census figures for tribes in India, the sex ratios, the gender ratios are much healthier than the rest of the country. So I don't, I always hesitate to say it's human nature to do X, Y, and Z, because, what we consider the norm is based on the paradigms in which
It's
we are
enculturated
right,
in our
exactly.
culture.
Yeah, and
I like with the traditional American Indians, that I don't know if it's the Iroquois nation or which, maybe it's some Western, Iroquois is in the East, but the elders, all of the decision making, they have to think 7 generations out. What are the consequences of these actions? Whether they're going to adopt Wi-Fi on their, reservation, or what? Every single, what they're going to invest in. Now, this is what I've read. And I don't know if it still holds true, because boy, we see a lot of casinos on those reservations, and I'm very mixed feelings about that. But the idea of cradle to grave, when artists are working with companies to manufacture products, thinking about the consequences, this is something humans don't do very well in general. It's all short-term thinking about the products, and in any case, I just love that indigenous rural story.
well, is it the question we have to ask ourselves is it humans, or is it the society and the paradigm that shapes how they think?
That's a good place to end, and let's hear it for our Okay, how's everyone doing? So, away we go. The last, thank you.
African elephant.
All right.
In Africa.
So for the cabinet number 3, we have Pepe and Mark.
In the Sahara. African elephant. Bye-bye.
Chop.
I have no idea what this thing is saying when I'm pushing buttons, so it's fine. Thank you for coming, and the question I have for you, and I was trying to figure out which one I would ask you, but I think.
Could you use the microphone?
Oh yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming, and I've been trying to figure out which question to ask you, but I think I'm going to ask you, how do you keep yourself sane and from being overwhelmed by global warming and climate change?
Well,
To talk to each other.
right.
Hey, how's it going?
Thank you. It's getting hot.
It really is. How I keep myself sane is the same motivation for me being involved at all in the world is that I feel at home in nature. I thrive on nature experiences, and everything I do in the arts and in the sciences is motivated by just having more direct experience of the environment and the world. That's my privilege, you know, is that it's here for me.
Right. So, you know, being from Houston, you know, we feel the effects of weather. I mean,
Is that Micah?
recent, yeah. So we feel the effects of the climate with flooding, right? And you know, and that might be depressing, but then you see also what people are powerful, you know, people are capable of doing, right? So, you know, they help each other, they think positive, and I guess the question is, how do we go beyond that? That's good, but how do we go back and fix the problem? Because, you know, it's 6 months now, you know, people are still without homes, people are going through their lives, but what's gonna change? Yeah, and I think that's a little bit uncomfortable. Yeah, that to know that yeah, we are good, you know, in when something happens, but we cannot do more than being good, you know, helping each other. But what do we do with the environment, right? And you know, and I was on my table yesterday. We were thinking about you know, dreaming, right, a vision, right, and I thought about, you know, in this date of data, right? We have huge amounts of data. You know, how can we use data to make people feel? So, you know, feel, yeah, just more direct interface with everyone, so that we can see what's happening right now in Hawaii, or what's happening, you know, in Brazil, or happening in Mexico, right? So that you know, there are these hot spots, right? And what's our role in that hot spot?
Can I ask
Yeah.
a question? I'd like to shift the conversation to personally. How are you physically, emotionally, and psychologically dealing with climate change?
Well, that's why I'm dressing, if I can feel that, right? That's gonna have an impact on my brain and my reward system, my emotional system. So I think you know, having this sort of interface, and maybe working with an artist to develop you know, that interface would be a way for my children to understand better, you know, first person understand, you know, what's going on in another place. For me as a scientist to develop better understanding of data, so that I can develop better models to address that.
You know, when you talk about Houston is really an excellent example, because it's one of those places where there's, you know, there's a privileged lifestyle, but then it's come up against the hard truths of flooding and change that have been ignored for so long because the data wasn't available to people. A lot of people make their life decisions and live in floodplains or live in areas that are not sustainable. So should they suffer for that? As going back to me individually, or to you or your children, how do we get our children, make the knowledge available to them so they can make life decisions that bring them in, you know, the same happiness and experiences that we have. You know, my selfish response, my initial selfish response of, you know, I just go and play in the surf, you know, and then I feel good about my life. And then you think, the burden of the affluent is that we have to, while we're playing in the surf, then we read the paper and we see that in Bangladesh there are Rohingya refugee communities that are on a thread based on both oppression and the environment, where, you know, when they're washed away, there's no bus coming to take them to a rescue, there's no Astrodome for them as a shelter, there's nothing, there's really nothing. And so personally, I can escape that knowledge by not reading the paper, but how do we live in that world where we get to play in the surf and the other people are drowning? You know, that's personal. You know, and so one response is that, yeah, we got to redo Houston so that the less affluent are not continually flooded and have less opportunities.
No, but you know what I see is that we're gonna redo Houston, so we're gonna build higher. So we're not addressing the flooding, we are addressing how we keep away from the flooding.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? And so, and of course this requires, you know, government, our you know, public servants to come with some decisions so that we solve the source of the problem. We don't adapt to the problem, but we solve the source of the problem. And I think an important part of this would be to make sure that this data is available, you know, to everyone, and especially with children, right? So they can understand the impact, right, of when they leave the water open, right? When they throw the plastic to the streets, right? And so I think that's going to require, you know, everyone to have a little piece of impact, right?
Yeah, and you know, the data, the information it comes in that scientific community, that it's not necessarily in the language that that is translates into a community forum always, and you know, actually I want to shout out to the idea of indigenous knowledge, you know, that there are communities have knowledge that they can bring to these problems. But the problem, it's a problem of scale too. We live in this massive world where decisions are made centrally and driven by power and economics, and the little things we do are overwhelmed by you know, the fossil fuels that are burning and overwhelming Cape Cod. Sorry, I just went into a deep hole there.
With that.
Yeah, take a deep breath, yes.
Let's do it together.
Okay. There you go. Okay, let's hear it from them, sir. Come on. Okay, you can sit here, because we're going to bring the 6 people up onto the dinner table.
Use the P word.
What's that? Okay.
Jay, let's find a substitute for Vandana.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I apologize. This has been wonderful. I'm sorry.
Here, I've been meant to talk. Take that. Okay. Have a good job.
Okay, let's see, we've got,
We need another scientist.
yeah, do we have a scientist that would like to come up to the table?
Liz can sit in for a second.
No, I just blame it on TV.
We have a scientist over there.
Stephanie has questions. Stephanie wants to be visitors. All right. I have your feels I want to talk about.
Okay, so you guys, folks, kind of spread around, move up, just connect more here.
Okay.
Okay, so this is called a long table. Now, the people that are out here, can you move closer? Could you come closer to the table?
Long table.
Yeah. Well, it's a long round. It's a long round table. You know, I mean, okay. As I said, this was created by Lois Weaver of Split Britches, a performance art group in New York City. She's a well-known artist. The idea is that this is a dinner table. This is a dinner conversation. This is not, you know, we're just hanging out at dinner, okay? And so the conversation happens here. There's one empty chair here. Now, anyone in the audience who wants to join the conversation can, well.
She doesn't even know what the conversation is.
Oh,
Well,
good. I'm joining.
There you go.
So, since that chair's already filled, should we just open it up to, no. But this is a process.
It's already working, you know.
It's already, I mean, you know. So, anyone in the audience in any time during this conversation that wants to join the conversation, you just go up and tap one of the people at the table and switch seats. So the idea is to keep the conversation going, but it's also opening it up to other people. And again, this is a conversation. It's not about, you know, someone pushing a certain agenda. It's like you're talking, right? So the question that I'm throwing out to you is, what action are you taking back with you from this conference, and what are you going to do? What, you know, who are you going to talk to? Who are you going to call up? What project are you going to pull out of the drawer? Who are you going to include in your conversation? What is it that you're taking home that's an action-oriented thing? Okay, so we can just start the conversation.
I'm inspired to do several things. One is as a writer, I will definitely write about this, and I did talk about myself as a mental scientist, and I do a lot of work on the internal landscape and what goes on in your mind and how that broadcasts to the world and makes such a difference in how people feel you, how people experience you, and what you're giving. So I will write about the connections I've made here, about the external and the internal, and why it matters that we clean up this as much as we clean up that out there. And then I have an event that I do called Provincetown Inspiration Weekend in the fall, and this makes me think about what can I do during that event that's about music and spoken word and inspiration and opening hearts, to include nature, include Mother Earth in that project.
I think Buddhism has been described as a science of the mind. It's a practice of studying your own mind. So that came up. One of the projects that I'm working on is with my collaborator Devorah Newmark. We have an artist collective called Fierce Bellies, and we are developing ways of engaging communities, literally asking people to immerse themselves in the natural world. So in one project, it's, you know, literally immersing yourself in water, and then using meditation, energy work to kind of blur the boundaries between self and world, and you know, that's I think it's a way of getting at the ways that we separate each other from between ourselves. We separate ourselves through divisions like art and science, you know, making the divide, which I think in a way separates ourselves from ourselves. You know, so many of us here have identified as both scientists and artists. I've been saying I'm you know, identify primarily as an artist, but in fact, I have been thinking about my art more and more as a form of research, and in some ways it's really not, you know, my process is really not that different than scientists. So so yeah, that's you know, I want to take what I've learned from this conference and feed it back into Fierce Bellies and involve the people in my community in Amherst, Massachusetts, in this kind of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary inquiry into how we can address the biggest catastrophe and issue in our lives.
So I think that our small table discussion yesterday about what a collaboration or what something like this should look like really brought forward to me the idea of cultivating a culture for your collaboration. And so when I'm supporting other people who are doing collaborations at Michigan State, what do I want to support in those collaborations? And the biggest thing for me that I'm going to take away from this is the idea of making spaces where people can be vulnerable. So during your discussion, I wanted to come up and shake the both of you and be like, get personal, get vulnerable, tell me what sucks, tell me like what this gut makes you feel, right? Like it's okay to step back and be like, this is how I feel, this is what outrages me, this is what makes me sick to my stomach. When I read these articles, this is the visceral feeling I have. And I think those vulnerable spaces are places where we can grow and say like, this is a thing that doesn't make me comfortable. This is how I want to be treated in a collaboration. This is how I don't want to be in service to, but want to work with. And so those are all these questions that now I'm walking away with, like, how do I build that? How do I make those spaces safe for people to experiment with feeling everything genuinely and being like out there with those feelings?
I totally agree, and I think when I'm wearing my true scientist hat, that it is trained into us to turn that off, right? We think of artists as people. We rarely think about scientists as people, and I need to remember to do that more often.
And I would like to measure those responses. You know? And I like to put those headsets here at the table and see what points connect those brains, right? Our brains. I think it's important. We know very little about our emotional response, about what matters for us, consciously or subconsciously. And I think the technology is at a point where we can start asking those questions and use that information, to not only to collaborate better, but to design programs that reach people. And so I think that's something I like to do.
You want to talk?
Is this?
Yeah.
Okay. Many years ago, I did a quilt project with pregnant teens about the hopes and fears of being a pregnant teenager in New York City in the projects. And I think the issue of emotions is the only thing that's going to turn this around. We have to find and engage people at their heart. And anyways, so I came here to support Ian's vision. It's a pivotal turning point in my life after 30 years of art and science collaborations that I started in New York that went international, and now I'm going back to be an artist maker again. But I'd like to do a project, and I think Provincetown is going to be the incubator space for it, because of its unique qualities of acceptance of differences, etc. But it would be hopes and fears in the face of climate change. And the children would be, it's sort of like, out of the mouths of babes. And yet there would be dialogues that would come into this, and there would be big sort of Mexican hats with three-dimensional textural images of the different sectors of the community and maybe their reactions to climate change, or maybe windmills and solar cells up there. But anyway, a visual as well as audio reaction to what their hopes and fears are in the face of this issue, so that then the public can be brought into it somehow. I want to have that interaction. I haven't got that part yet, but it's all in development. So if you have any ideas, I would love to get your feedback.
I take your point about not expressing enough outrage or personal emotion, but believe me, it's there, and I express it all the time. Sometimes you need an invitation in a community to, bring yourself into it. But one idea that I'm working with, and I teach outdoor drawing classes. We do go on walks and draw and contemplate and do observation exercises. And a lot of it is about exploring your environmental autobiography, exploring your response to place. And we all come to the moment with a whole life experience of place, the places that shaped us. And they're tied up intimately with our relationships and our feeling of identity in the world. So I'm going on. I'm going to some refugee camps in Greece next month to try to explore teaching this environmental autobiography, sketching and journaling concept in refugee camps to people who are displaced, who might need the invitation to re-establish their claim on their identity of place. So that's my experiment, and I don't know whether I'm going to be welcome or whether my method will, it'll grow and change in the real world. So that's what I got.
One thing I've been struck by listening to everybody and thinking about the amazing work that people are doing is, of course I've been thinking about me, and I've been thinking about my own struggles in having confidence in the ability of my work to properly voice the concerns and the passions and the thoughts that I have. And so I feel very inspired by the people here and the self-confidence that they've put forward. And so I'm hoping to just borrow some of that and carry forward and be able to move forward with a little bit more confidence in, there's something about coming into your own later and having lived a path that's been secret poet in the world of biologists and secret biologist in the world of poets, and those things kind of moving forward on parallel tracks a little more slowly than my colleagues because they were divided and now are finally converging. I think all of us struggle with self-doubt, but I have been so inspired by the confidence people have brought here and the community that this represents. And I also just want to offer thanks to the conversation as a result of Hemlock Hospice in particular, where I hit my forehead in my hand. I hit my forehead on my hand. I hit my hand on my forehead and said, "Oh my God, you idiot. Why have you not thought about in this project that's going to be published next year that's grappling with our interactions with Antarctica as this place set apart for science and public domain and the tourism industry and the benefits and the huge costs of that relationship? Why have I not included a direct action platform from that?" And so I will be doing that, and I'm really grateful for being here and being inspired to do that.
I have, well, somebody taps me, I'll say one of the things that happened during the process of the conversation today was when they talked about, they used the term preferred landscape futures. And it kept resonating with me, preferred landscape futures. I thought, whose preferred landscape futures, right? And I thought about the time in Soweto and thinking about the way that people live in the shanties and the colorfulness of them and the community and the connection, the collaboration, cooperation that happens to make that work. And then the people who are living in the high-rises with the gated fences and security and what that is. And then I think about in Appalachia, where they have the preferred landscape that was in the picture, but there's a tremendous amount of poverty, and they don't actually have. So it just struck in me as a writer and a person who observes and speaks about, when we say anything like that, preferred landscape futures, who are we speaking about and whose vision? So it helps me be more articulate in my own language and more careful, and all the things I presume. And so that's what I got.
I wanted to say a great thank you to Ian and to all these brilliant people that are here. I've really learned a lot, I've grown a lot, and I've been inspired. I've been very interested in art since I was a child as well as science. And one of the things I want to take from here is the Harvard Forest concept of changing perceptions while walking on a nature trail and implement it someplace here on the Lower Cape. And it could be at the National Park or one of the land conservation trusts in one of the towns. I think it would be just a phenomenal project. I mean, I've tried to implement it through one of the projects that two towns on the Cape are working on together, the Herring River Project, where, and even at a town meeting, and it didn't go over very well. So I've been thinking about that kind of intervention, whether temporary or permanent, on the landscape that is very low impact and would communicate effectively to people looking at that or experiencing that landscape. And so this has inspired me to take that further again. One thing I have come to recraft in my own mind is something about sustainability and energy, but finding responsible energy solutions. About 7 years ago, and since the 70s, I've really been thinking about alternative energy sources, and I had very positive and viewpoints about wind turbines. And about 7 years ago, they wanted to put about 6 of them in my town, and somebody unexpected brought it to my attention that they may not be so positive. And I did a lot of research, and I found that there's a lot of problems with wind turbines. I mean, some of them are human health impacts, even cardiovascular issues, and dizziness, nausea, headaches, chronic sleep deprivation, things of that nature. And so there are issues, and lots of bird kills, I mean, really very serious. Maybe even problems with marine mammals. So I caution people as we look in the future and we try to find solutions that we're looking for responsible solutions. I mean, there are lots of solutions, and some of them may not be, they maybe have more to do with personal responsibility and not large scale. So thank you.
I know for me, it's been important for me to bring inclusivity into play, and my cross-sectionality is that I come from, I mean, I have degrees of education, higher education. I am an artist. I'm not a scientist, but I was a physical therapist, so I have an understanding of the human psyche to some degree, and comfortability, and how important that is for people to be able to come and sit at the table in the first place, or whether or not they're invited or not. And so I come also with degrees of privilege, and then at the same time, I'm not as much privileged as some others. So I'm really here to also, or I'm inspired to continue to try to connect the dots, to reach out to communities who for various reasons, just to reach out to more communities. I know at the end of this afternoon, there's an Indivisible meeting. Tomorrow I am meeting with a group that is the Cape Cod Climate Change Collaborative. And so once again, it's about sharing information that I've learned here, and that's kind of what I'm doing.
So I'd like to tell you about some ideas that I'm getting from this meeting in terms of how I can apply them to my research. And I started a collaboration with the Humanities about a year ago, where I partnered with a colleague from the Creative Writing Program at the University of Houston. And as a part of the assignments, we send the students to the community at different times of the day, different conditions, and while they are wearing our system, so that we can record their movement. They have a camera, they have the brain cap, and we're looking at embodiment of art here. How movement affects your creative process, and how the context affects also that. And I'm thinking maybe we could expand that to look at the effect of the greater space, and the effect on wellness, the effect on mental health, the effect on why not in creativity. So I took that as an idea that I found here. How can I can connect my work with the climate change problem, and then something that has been very successful in my research is that we are partnering. Nobody can solve the problem by itself, right? And for this problem to be attacked, you need big data. So we are partnering with different labs, different cities, even countries now, and they're taking the local condition, right? So we have done a study in Mexico, right? We have very different culturally, socially than the United States, right? And to the extent that I can fill in the network and get the local condition and gather this data, maybe we can make sense of how the environment affects our intentionality, our emotions, our creative process, and maybe use that information to devise better interventions, better way of communicating what's the challenge.
Exactly.
And so I'm very helpful, very thankful for that. I mean, this is something maybe I go here.
Thank you.
So I am an artist, and I have a house at a very vulnerable point on Cape Cod in Truro. We are sitting in the front row of climate change, and it affects me personally. It's not something that is out there in data, but when I lie in bed at night, I'm afraid of the flood that might come, or the big storm that knocks out or knocks down the trees next to my house, and the house is going to be damaged. Or people will even die, or we won't even get out anymore because the road will be cut off by water. These are scenarios that personally I have in my head, and I would like to, and I'm very grateful for this conference here. It has given me a lot of information, but also a lot of hope to that there is something we can do about it, that we at least could be together in this. And I thought maybe I will focus on this little microcosmos where I actually have the house, which is ecologically super interesting and affects people. It's salt water meets fresh water, and how it affects the few people who still live there. We are in the national seashore, so it's wild. It's wild. It's really wild. It's not like Provincetown is super vulnerable, but it's not wild like is national seashore where we are. Anyway, I'm emotionally very carried away by this, and I think this conference has helped me to maybe focus in on this local issue and make it bigger as an example for global climate change.
Well, for me, attending this conference sort of opened my eyes a little bit in the sense that my background, I'm a scientist, and so I realized that, but I'm also very concerned about the environment, and I realized that we scientists usually are working in our little bubble and doing our research, producing data, but then I realized by attending here that a big component, if we want to make a change, is the communication piece. It's like, how do we get this out to the, to the general public and to especially children. So after living many years, 13 years in the Washington DC area, where specifically in a town, Tacoma Park, Maryland, where people are super conscious about the trees and the environment and the recycling and all that, we moved to Houston, where people are very much, immune to that idea of climate change and recycling and all that, and so it's been very frustrating for me. And I think one piece that we are maybe missing in all this is the education of people. And so I know everybody has big plans here, and I'm a little humble, person here. So my action, I guess, when I go back, will be to try to transmit this to the school children in the school nearby. Maybe a small presentation to the classroom where my son attends elementary school. And maybe I was thinking maybe make a little board or something in front of our house where I can put very small, humble piece of information about, climate change and how the carbon is increasing and how people maybe shouldn't idle their cars for an hour while their kid is, attending the soccer practice, which is something that you see often there.
And then I'm going to add that as an artist, I'm also, going to really look more closely at my work and see, is there a way for me to really bring in both the science as well as the emotional response that I have to what's going on in the world now. I think it's important to think about activism and one area. I think of myself as a movement artist as well. Sometimes I can be really quiet and silent about things, but movement is really powerful. In the comedy last night routine, it was like, that was pretty intense. The person who really, acted out in movement as a form. And for myself, I think of myself as a movement artist, as in physical movement, but also the movement of shifting the paradigm into a better world. And so I challenge or invite anyone who wants to do any street performance. I don't want to do it on my own, and yet I want to collaborate with others, so that we could pull together ideas and put something out there that others will respond to. And knowing that each person, or the audience, is forever changing, because once again, we have people, within the different stratas of
Was
society.
that you on the stilts with the water protector? Were you standing on the stilts yourself, or was it somebody? You were in that ensemble, right?
Which?
It was an ensemble of people, and there was the water protectors, and somebody was on stilts, and there were people walking in costumes. Yeah.
No, I wasn't at stilts. Which event are you referring to?
No, it was just a parade in Provincetown about Earth Day last year.
Okay. I wasn't on stilts, but I was in the procession.
Right.
Yeah, thanks.
Hello, everyone. I've been sitting back and observing. As the observer that I am, I'm just starting off a career in radio this year, and I come from an artistic background. And it's been a pleasure to learn with all of you in the last couple days. I've been thinking a lot about communication. Obviously, being in radio, I believe communication is very important, and I think that people think in stories. And so it leaves me with a lot of questions of, we have all of this data, how can you extract just one simple story from that data that people can then connect to? I also think that people, the general public, is also feeling discouraged by the amount of depressing climate change stories. So how can we truthfully tell those, but also remember to celebrate the wins through stories and communicate those too, so people don't feel, so people are aware of the positive changes that are happening and are aware that there are some scientists who are saying, I think we can do this, I think we have to set our minds to that. I want to put together stories about climate change skills. I was talking with a couple people about this last night, and because I think there's the bigger questions of how do we curb the effects of climate change, but also, we're going to be left with a lot of flooding and fires, and we've been seeing a lot of that in the past year. And I think, especially in urban areas, people have lost a lot of survival skills that used to be second nature. And I want to connect with people, not just scientists, but also outdoor enthusiasts, tradespeople, people who have these survival skills. Because I think a lot of people are Googling, what do I do if my house floods? What do I do if there's a fire? These are all things that used to be considered common sense, which aren't anymore, and for understandable reasons, because people don't need them in a lot of urban centers in particular. So I just mentioned that in case anybody has any ideas of people I might connect with, but I really want to find stories of people surviving in situations, because I think that's what gets people to remember skills. Like, I heard this story about someone surviving a flood. Now I know I need to set aside as much water as I can in advance when I know that there might be a flood coming to my city or something like that. So yeah, just a quick announcement, I guess, and thank you all so much. It's been such a pleasure.
What a great radio voice.
So I don't mean to interrupt anyone. I think we already went around, but I think because this is supposed to be a format of a dinner table, and we're just going around and telling our own story, we're not having the conversation. So maybe we should make it a little bit more informal. So one comment that I had about what you said about the radio programs and all that is that sometimes I feel like a lot of the action is being taken places where the action is not needed as much as other places. So having this conversation, I'm thinking a lot of people is talking about doing stuff in Provincetown and all that, and I understand that because many people here are local, right? But I'm thinking, well, I mean, the impact that you can have doing something in Provincetown worldwide, right, to the climate change and all that, is going to be small compared to the impact that you will have if you could convince people in Houston to recycle, for example, right? I mean, the recycling in Houston will be so much bigger than what you're doing here. So I think it's not only communicating and creating the stories, but actually directing them to the places that are more needed.
I like that idea. I like the idea of directing the stories and being where you're needed, but also doing what you can where you are. So it's an and, I think, yeah. But I have a friend who lives on the Big Island of Hawaii, and she's an artist, and she paints an endangered species. And she does it with this elephant named Rama, who paints first the canvas, and then she paints the endangered species. And this exhibit is moving around, and she's trying to figure out how she can get this exhibit seen by more people. So in order to share, like, she learned about sharks, and I had never known how important sharks were to the whole thing. And it's because of her art that I had to look at it and say, tell me, Callie, why are you painting sharks? And she explained the number of species and how they are essential to the planet. And anyway, that kind of thing is really important, wherever it is, right? Yeah.
Just a quick aside, very quickly. I think that there are ways to communicate science and art, but also there's another piece to this too. I mean, being involved in your community, and I mean, these little towns have like energy committees or recycling committees or whatnot. There may be something in Houston that you may go back and find, and you may get appointed to the board and make a real change.
So I really like your question because I think there is this real hard problem about how do people think about things at the local scale, what we experience every day, and how do we get people to think about the planetary scale, right? We don't think in these numbers. We have a hard time imagining how big the planet is. And it's super hard to imagine that my piece of the planet connects with somebody's piece of the planet. And I'm gonna pick on Bangladesh just because I sort of always think about it as being on the opposite side of the planet for me, even though it's not. And so I guess I would ask the artists, how do we figure out ways to get people to recognize scale, right? That their place, even though it feels tiny, is a part of something at a really large scale. And is that a place where art can help science get across things that people can't kind of internalize necessarily?
Well, as an artist, I think I think on a different level and usually don't think narrow. I think more of how, like, for instance, water affects us all and connects us all. we all need it constantly, we all release it constantly, we are part of the water cycle. So there is no, actually not so much difference, or not, we are all connected with all living things on Earth. And this realization drives my more abstract art, but it's also emotional, but it's on a bigger scale. And for this other thing that I was talking about, look at your local place where you live, and then make some kind of model that could be transferred to another place. Because this is just an example for one place, and the same thing happens actually in many other places. It's not that it's only happening here. So every little microcosm that we can analyze and look at, we can actually transfer to a greater, to different places that have exactly the same problem.
So I guess I'm wondering, are the small, I just want to follow up, are the individual connections, do they add up to the planet, or is there something bigger than just all the individual thoughts and the individual actions? And I'm not sure how to get that across.
Well, the thing is that we have to be experience ourselves as one, and not as insular or separated.
Well, that's exactly what I was thinking, is that the connection between the science of the unity principle in people and the idea, to me, the fundamental error is that we're separate. The fundamental error. So if we believe and know that it's not true, that we are actually connected, every single thing I think, say, do matters to the whole. So.
Yeah, I think too. I mean, as far as the butterfly effect, or I mean, I think there's every person has their piece that they can do, but I think thinking big is really important at the same time. I mean, it's parallel paths. And about 7 years ago, I realized it wasn't just creating or doing the science that I was doing. It was becoming politically active. And and now I'm active on the local level, the county level, the state level, and the federal level. So I am doing things on all levels, and those have all to do with sustainability. So I think that's another piece of it as well.
Hillary, to answer your question, artist to artist, how do you make scale matter? So when artists look at really small things that you can't see with the naked eye, we like to make them really big so that you can experience the visceral feeling of a cell or of a strand of DNA. You can do the reverse of that, and this is a classic thing that artists do. You go micro to macro or macro to micro. The world is a big place, so let's make it smaller. And I think that's how you deal with the scale of the world, is by making it smaller. So there's, I can't remember the artist's names, but there was an installation a while back where you stepped into, I don't know if it was like a telephone booth or you sat at a table with a phone on it, and you picked up the phone and you were connected with a visitor who was visiting the sister exhibit on the other side of the world, and you just have a conversation with a stranger for however long is natural for your conversation, right? So that makes the world feel like a really small place. So I don't know, enacting that sort of principle, like the world's huge, what are we gonna do? It's like, well, let's just make it smaller. We have the technology, right?
And then as far as the scope of a project, I often think like performance art really offers itself the opportunity to go with something that's very simple that everyone really can connect to, and if that's done in a place that's as public as like in front of our town hall, where literally we have people coming from all over the world, I mean, and then they're going out back home into their communities as well. So.